Welcome to ARCS Foundation Honolulu Chapter's July Pauhana presentation. I'd like to introduce Suilan Ellsworth. This is her last official function as co-president of the Honolulu Chapter of ARCS Foundation. Suilan, take it away.
Okay. I would like to welcome you to our Pauhana series. ARCS stands for Achievement Rewards for College Scientists, and we are one of many chapters across the U.S. We are a nonprofit, volunteer women's organization that works to advance science in America through support for outstanding doctoral candidates in science and health fields. In 2021, our chapter was responsible for 19 $5,000 unrestricted scholar awards grants to UH postdocs. Since our chapter's founding in 1974, that's 47 years of raising funds, our small chapter has provided more than $2 million to help grad students in the STEM fields achieve their goals. Since the funds are unrestricted, students can use the monies for whatever they need. Some use it to attend conferences, and others use it in their research and equipment. Our members believe in the power of research to expand knowledge and address pressing problems. With numerous global issues facing us, we turn to science to help us find solutions to those problems. The immediate issue of protecting ourselves from the COVID virus is an example of how science stepped up to develop a new type of vaccine, putting the brakes on the pandemic. Currently, there are quite a few vaccine options globally with differing technologies. My own interest in scientific inquiry led to my participation in the MultiEthnic Cohort Study about 28 years ago. Little did I know then that one day I would be introducing the principal investigator in the study. Study follows more than 215,000 residents of Hawaii and California in their propensity or lack to develop cancer and other chronic diseases. Dr. Loic LeMarchand is a UH Cancer Center physician who has made it his life's work to research the biological and lifestyle factors in the cause and progression of cancer and the ethnic racial differences in cancer risk within the Japanese American, Native Hawaiian, African American, Latin, and Caucasian groups. His resume runs pages, and his accomplishments are numerous, locally, nationally, and internationally. He has published more than 780 peer-reviewed articles, has received the UH Board of Regents Medal for Excellence in Research, and has been named highly cited researcher in the Web of Science list. That's not all. He has mentored a dozen young research investigators who have gone on to establish NCI supported research at UH and other universities, as well as trained more than 35 undergrad and graduate students and 15 postdoc trainees. He was our Chapter Scientist of the Year in 2020. We are very honored to have him here today to reveal what the MEC study has uncovered, how ethnicity and lifestyle affect cancer risk. Welcome, Dr. LeMarchand.
Thank you, Suilan, for this very nice introduction. And I'm grateful to have gotten the prize last year from the ARCS chapter. And I'm delighted to be here, talk about the MEC. I've been part of it since the very beginning. However, I was not the PI from the start. In Hawaii, we had Dr. Larry Colonel, who actually got an ARCS prize, I think in 2005. So it's a comeback for the MEC. So what I like to do is to talk about the research we've been doing on health disparities related to cancer in the Multi-Ethnic Cohort Study that we abbreviate as MEC study. And I'll start by defining what we mean by cancer health disparities, showing you a few examples of such disparities, and describe a bit the multi-ethnic cohort, how it was assembled, the kind of data we collected, and show you some results for a number of cancer. But obviously, I can't talk about everything, but I selected a few things that I think were impactful in the health prevention field. So the definition that the National Cancer Institute gives for cancer disparities, there are adverse differences between certain population groups in cancer measures such as incidence, which is number of new cases for a given year, for example, or prevalence, which is number of cases alive, or mortality, survival, which is usually given as 5-year survival rates, or it can be quality of life, or differences in related health conditions, screening rates, stage of diagnosis. So it's kind of a broad definition. At the national level, there are a number of differences across ethnic groups that are well established. And for example, African Americans have a higher risk of triple negative breast cancer, which is a subset of breast cancer, which is particularly aggressive. And indeed, we have a poor survival for breast cancer in general. Kidney cancer is more common in American Indian and Alaska Natives. Liver cancer is more common in Asian Pacific Islanders and American Indians. Prostate cancer is more common in African Americans. Actually, they have double the mortality rate of whites for this cancer. So disparities don't have to be linked to ethnicity or race, but they can be about living in a rural area. Cervical cancer is more common in a rural area, or it can be about other minorities. And obviously health disparities are not limited to cancer. They also exist for most chronic diseases, shown here for heart disease in red, green in cancer, and diabetes in blue. And this is for mortality. And as you can see, actually there's a good correspondence between heart disease and diabetes, and cancer. It's because they share a number of risk factors. But African Americans have usually higher death rate for both of those diseases, and Asian Pacific Islanders lower death rate for cancer and heart disease. However, those are national data, and they usually group Asian and Pacific Islanders and other, including Native Hawaiians together, which is problematic for us because actually different groups of Asians and most of all Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders have very different rates of cancer. And just to show you an example using Hawaii, I'm showing you breast cancer incidence rates by 5-year categories for the US whites, which is in the dashed green light. And as you can see, Native Hawaiians have much higher rates, and our whites are comparable to the national average. Also, there might have been an increase in rates in the last 5 years. But I wanted also to show you what happens over time. Rates are not static. Here in Japanese American, we have seen an increase in breast cancer rates in yellow here. Actually, since 1960, when the tumor registry started in Hawaii. So rates of breast cancer have been increasing for Japanese. And now they are actually at the same level as whites. Well, when they started, they were very, very low compared to whites. Chinese have usually lower rates, but Filipinos might be experiencing an increase in recent years. So it's something we're going to be following. So there are some major differences in incidence here for breast cancer, but for most cancers, really across cancer sites and across ethnic groups. There are also differences across ethnic groups for risk factors, such as I'm showing you for obesity from our data in the multi-ethnic cohort study, where obesity is common, very common in Native Hawaiians and African Americans women, and to some extent in Latinas. And it's lower, much lower in Japanese compared to whites. So there are also differences in frequency of risk factors for cancer, but as a rule, those differences in prevalence of risk factors don't explain all of the ethnic differences in risk for the various cancer sites. Also, disparities can be in the strength of the association or strength of the effect of those risk factors on disease, showing you for diabetes, type 2 diabetes. As you can see, as BMI increased from normal weight, overweight, and obese, the increase in the risk of diabetes, which is well established, is actually quite different across ethnic groups. It's much greater in Japanese and Hawaiians than in whites. So differences in the strength of the effect. We see something similar for breast cancer. When BMI increases to overweight and obese, you can see that the association, the risk associated with BMI, for example, with being obese is much greater in Native Hawaiian and Japanese than for whites. For whites, your risk increased by about 30%, whereas for Japanese, it's 60% and 80% for Hawaiians. So not only there are differences in the frequency of risk factors, but there are differences in the strength of the association between risk factor and cancer. So the multi-ethnic cohort is a collaboration between the University of Hawai Cancer Center and the University of Southern California. And the goal has been from the beginning to understand those ethnic differences that exist in cancer. And the focus has been on lifestyle factors such as diet, smoking, physical activity, but also environmental exposures, as well as genetics, so genetic risk factors. We get federal funding from National Cancer Institute. The study started in 1993. People were recruited between 93 and 96 by mailing questionnaire to a large number of Hawaii residents and Los Angeles residents, Los Angeles County. And those who responded, who filled the questionnaire, sent it back, entered the cohort, and 215,000 men and women did that, about half in Hawaii and half in Los Angeles. And they were between age 45 and 75 when we started. In addition to filling out questionnaires, we are able to, and use this information, we're able to link the cohort to tumor registries in Hawaii and California. We are fortunate because we have statewide tumor registries in both states, and they are part of the surveillance epidemiology and results program of the National Cancer Institute. So they are very high quality. They are adhere to national standards, and they artified almost all cancer cases in their respective states. And we have made follow-up questionnaires every 5 years. So we have just finished the mailing of our 6th questionnaire. And we were able to collect blood and urine from a large proportion of the cohort, about 70,000 people. That occurs over the years, not at baseline, unfortunately. We were unable to get funded to do that. It was very expensive. But most of them were collected about 10 years after baseline. And as you heard, we have 5 major ethnic groups in the cohort: Native Hawaiians, Japanese, and whites, mostly from Hawaii, and African Americans and Latinos, mostly from Los Angeles. So in terms of overall impact, it's unique in the world because it's really the most ethnically diverse cohort study in existence, and it's rather large. It has been very productive in terms of its research, about 850 publications, about 150 grants have used the cohort. And we have, as you heard, trained a lot of students, postdocs. And in addition to that, our data are available. We have a process to review requests from outside investigators, which is actually the same process as we use for inside investigators from UH and USC. And we have shared our data with more than 80 different institutions across the world, mostly in the United States, but also in Japan, Europe, China, Australia. And so the data are used by many scientists across the world. And really the results, and I'm going to give you some example, have helped understand health disparities for a number of major cancer sites, but also risk factors such as obesity and diabetes. And we also been looking at survival from cancer. If you want more information, we have a website which I think is quite informative. You can find a good number of detail on the cohorts. And, just to give you an idea of numbers, as you heard, a total of about 215,000 participants at baseline. The largest group was Japanese with 57,000, then white 49,000, Latino 47,000, African American 35,000, a smaller group of Native Hawaiians because it's a smaller group to start with, but about 14,000. And just a little bit more than half the participants have passed away. So we have still about 103,000 participants. The average age is 81, so this cohort has aged. And we have now something like 888 centenarians. So as you can imagine, we have been shifting a bit the topic of our research to now study healthy aging and diseases of old age beyond cancer. Just to give you a flavor of what questionnaire included, we had detailed information on race and place of birth of the participants themselves, but also their parents, and a question about education, smoking history, sun exposure, some medical history, reproductive history in women, physical activity, family history of cancer. And we had a very detailed food frequency questionnaire, which actually took 24 pages out of the 26 pages of the questionnaire. And combined with a food composition table, it allowed us to compute intake of foods and nutrients, as well as compute some scores about diet quality. So if you're part of the cohort, actually, you may remember this questionnaire. It looks like that for the diet history. We asked people to tell us for a number of food or food group, the frequency of consumption with a number of categories going from never or hardly ever to once a day or 2 or more times a day. And also we asked them to give us an idea of their usual portion size for each eating occurrence. And for most food, we had pictures of what we meant by small or medium or large. And based on that, we were able to compute amount of food consumed and through our food composition table, amounts of nutrients for their usual diet. So as I mentioned, we also mailed a follow-up questionnaire every 5 years, including a repeat of the baseline questionnaire at 10 years, which repeated the food frequency questionnaire. So we have 2 measures of diet, which is very useful in terms of looking at change, the effect of improving or worsening one's diet on risk. And we updated some exposures that naturally change, such as smoking or obesity, weight. We ask about screening history. And in more recent years, we ask about social and emotional support, quality of life, physical functioning, things more related to healthy aging, as well as more recently frailty and discrimination based on race, and now that it's legal in both states, medical use of medical marijuana. So just to give you a few examples of the research we have done, so the model is kind of the same for each topics that we study, is to first describe some differences across the ethnic group, try to understand them by doing specific studies using often biomarkers. And from this understanding, then try to translate those findings to proposing some ways to correct those ethnic disparities. Just to show you an example for smoking and lung cancer, we found that actually for the same given amount of smoking, actually amount during their lifetime, 20 cigarettes per day in this case, there were major differences in risk, lifetime risk of lung cancer across the ethnic group. For African American and Hawaiians, the risk was about 50% greater than whites, and for Japanese and Latino, 50% lower than whites. So a twofold difference between the extreme groups here. And so again, not due to smoking. So obviously that was perplexing, but we were able to focus on the metabolism of nicotine, which is done mostly by an enzyme CYP2A6, which is in the liver. And it's possible to measure a ratio of metabolite of nicotine that reflect the activity of this enzyme. And when we rank people by tertile of this activity, of CYP2A6 activity, we found that using a marker of internal dose, which is really nicotine and all its metabolites, we found that people who have a rapid metabolism of nicotine were actually smoking differently. We were inhaling more and extracting more nicotine from each cigarette, which is reflected in the amount of nicotine circulating in the body of those smokers. So you would expect them to be at greater risk of lung cancer because not only they inhale obviously nicotine, but they inhale carcinogens from tobacco smoke, and thus would be expected to have an increase in lung cancer risk. So what we did, the next step was to look at genetic variant across the genome that would be associated with CYP2A6 activity measured again through this metabolite ratio in the urine. And we found, as we kind of expected, that all genetic variants associated with CYP2A6 activity were around the region of the genome where the gene CYP2A6 coding for the enzyme was located. And we took those SNP and we look at association then with lung cancer in a large number of studies, including the MEC, but other studies as well. And we found that those SNPs were associated with lung cancer risk. Here you see the line of no association. And so those SNPs found with activities for CYP2A6 were found to be associated with an increased risk of lung cancer. So now we are looking whether we could use those SNPs to predict risk of lung cancer in smokers and help select people for screening now that there is a way to screen for lung cancer through low-dose computed tomography, X-ray. So that's our next step in our research. So again, starting from an observation of differences across ethnic group to trying to understand it biologically, and then try to translate it to try to correct those disparities in risk. We did something similar for obesity, where we found as I showed you for breast cancer, a difference in the association of BMI and breast cancer across ethnic group. So we recruited about 1,800 MEC participants. They underwent a DEXA, which is a low energy X-ray scan to look at bone density, but in our case, body fat. And we also have them go through an abdominal MRI so we could precisely measure the distribution of fat in their abdomen. And we found that differences in the amount of visceral fat for a given level of total adiposity. So people with the same adiposity level, if they were Japanese, they had more fat, what's called visceral fat, which is inside the abdominal cavity around the organs, so inside the organs such as the liver. And African American had less visceral fat for the same, again, amount of total body fat. And actually, African American have more fat under their skin, subcutaneous fat, and Japanese who have more of their fat inside the abdomen. And that's very meaningful because it is known that visceral fat, intra-abdominal fat, is much more metabolically active and is much more strongly associated with diabetes and heart disease. And we were hypothesizing cancer, and we found an association with breast cancer. So as we could not have thousands of people go through those expensive scans to measure visceral fat, we actually build a biomarker score by measuring biomarkers and looking at their association with visceral fat in our 1,800 participants. We built a score using blood biomarkers that were predicting visceral fat well. So we went and we then measured those biomarkers in the blood, pre-diagnostic blood of breast cancer patients and similar women matched on race and ethnicity in the MEC, and found that women with, when categorized into tertile, women in the higher tertile of this visceral fat score were about 50% greater risk than women in the lower tertile. And we found that this association was actually much greater in Japanese, probably reflecting their disposition for accumulating fat in their abdomen. So our next, what we think that might have as, might explain actually the increase in incidence of breast cancer in Japanese in Hawaii, that, that I showed you earlier compared to whites. So, and the lack of increase in Japanese until very recently, possibly, in breast cancer incidence in Japan. And this is because in Japan, we have not had this obesity epidemic like we have seen in the US. And so we think we are now more targeting more closely visceral fat as maybe an explanation for, as a way to predict risk of breast cancer. And actually we have actually run a pilot study to try to decrease visceral fat among men and women who are overweight or obese, but are above the average in terms of visceral fat in our population, by looking at the effect of intermittent energy restriction combined to a Mediterranean diet. And we found that this regimen was very effective in reducing visceral fat. So we are trying to get money to expand this study. And what I mean by intermittent energy restriction, and why we chose it, is because the best way to lose weight is to limit your caloric intake and exercise more, but it is very difficult to burn enough calories to lose weight. But it is difficult also to keep restricting your calorie for a long time. It's hard to do long term, and usually there's a catch-up phenomenon. With intermittent energy restriction, which in this case is defined by restricting calories by 70%, so quite a bit, for 2 days during the week, and the remaining 5 days eating no restriction, but in our case, a Mediterranean diet. And So as I said, we found that this regimen was quite effective in reducing not only weight, but also the amount of visceral fat. So hopefully we can expand that. And we have done that for 3 months. We're going to expand that to 6 months with a larger group and measure different biomarkers. So a last example is about prostate cancer. And you may know that there are very few lifestyle factors associated with prostate cancer, and genetics might play a greater role than for the other common cancers. In the MEC, we have done a number of genetic studies, most of them were led by collaborators at USC. For prostate cancer, there is a region in the genome that actually we identified to be associated with prostate cancer. A number of variants were found to predict an increased risk for prostate cancer. But in addition, we found variants that were specific to African Americans. So ethnic specific variants, which in this case were rare, are found only in 1.4% of the population, African American population, but were associated with a 5-fold increase in risk. And when combined to family history of prostate cancer, were associated with an almost 9-fold increase in risk. So it starts to be predictive and would be an indication for screening. So as you know, screening for prostate cancer is usually done by prostate-specific antigen test, PSA test, which has a negative effect of not being able to distinguish indolent disease, tumors that will not grow and kill anybody, from aggressive tumors. So the hope is by looking at a number of risk variants that by themselves don't explain much of the risk, but combined might explain more of the risk, that could be used to, again, select people for screening, high-risk individuals for screening. And this is results from MEC, but other studies as well, very large numbers. And when we ranked participants by the number of those risk variants that they had in their genome, looking at 180 risk variants in total, and classified people by if they were in the first decile or the last decile of this total number of risk variants in their genome. You can see that the risk was increased 4-fold in whites. But unfortunately, because most of those risk variants were actually identified in whites, because it's where the study have been done. You look at those numbers, they are much higher in whites. Those variants are not as predictive for the other ethnic groups. Also, they are somewhat predictive, certainly not as much as for whites. So what needs to be done, obviously, is to studying more of other ethnic groups to find better markers for them. And obviously something we are trying to contribute with MEC. And especially African Americans, which again are at very high risk of prostate cancer. So another, as I mentioned, issue with PSA screening is that it does not predict aggressive behavior for a tumor. So, if the tumor can be predicted to be aggressive and, will develop into a fast-growing tumor with metastasis, then at diagnosis, you could select patients for more aggressive treatment and hopefully have a better prognosis. So one way to do that with genetic variants is, in this case, looking at rare genetic variants that are often associated with higher increase in risk, and in genes that have been associated with not just prostate cancer, but other cancers as well. And you recognize breast cancer, this breast cancer gene here, with ERCA2, and a gene associated coding for DNA repair enzyme, ATM. And you can see that just counting the number of variants in those rare variants, and rare variant means usually not found in more than 1% of the population. Just counting those variants, you can predict risk quite well. So again, it's something that you can only do if you're studying the right population and looking at having some comprehensive approaches. So another area of research that we have developed in the MEC in more recent years is to add neighborhood or local area level information data. We have in the MEC kept the residency history of our participants since baseline. So we have 25, 28 years of follow-up. And we, especially in California, where, certainly in terms of air pollution and environmental exposures, there have been a lot of surveys done, environmental measurements done at a very granular level geographically. We were able to relate air pollution level to where our MEC participants live for 25 years and how it changed over time. And we were able to show association between air pollution and breast cancer, not only just by level of air pollution, but also by distance of where their residents were from major roads in Los Angeles. So that's just an example, but we have added to the MEC a good number now of what's called geospatial measures. So based on where people live and work, but in our case, we live because we don't have work addresses, unfortunately. For example, we have added information on tobacco control policies for counties where people live in Hawaii and California. We also have a measure of neighborhood socioeconomic status based on income, housing, and different measures of deprivation as well, racial ethnic segregation, and racial ethnic composition of census tract. It's those data coming from the census usually. We also have information on built environment, such as green space or walkability of neighborhoods, availability of parks, whether there are any fast food restaurants, number of outlets selling alcohol or tobacco by neighborhoods. And actually, we found association between what's called a obesogenic environment that just by the physical nature of it makes difficult to find healthy food or to exercise. We found an association with obesity in the cohort. And as I mentioned, we also have data on air pollution. So those are examples, just to give you a flavor of the kind of impact we have had on public health prevention. Not only we have characterized multiple health disparities that were not known, such as the differences in the association between smoking and lung cancer across ethnic groups, or some that were poorly understood, such as differences in body fat distribution. We have done a lot of study on diet and cancer, and and other diseases as well. Those were used over the years for dietary guidelines, dietary recommendation, more recently for the 2020 dietary guidelines for Americans. We have those differences I showed you about lung cancer risk associated with smoking, and especially the increased risk in African Americans, was the basis for a recent change in the US Preventive Services Task Force recommendation for lung cancer screening. They have reduced the number of pack years to qualify for screening, a number of pack years that you needed to have smoked during your life. It's went from 30 to 25, so it made more African Americans and Native Hawaiians qualified for screening. We believe our finding for prostate cancer influenced a paradigm shift in how to use PSA screening and use family history and starting to use genetic variants as well. And I think we have increased awareness of the importance of visceral fat, especially in Asians, Pacific Islanders, and liver fat, in causing increased risk for diabetes and certain cancers in Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And also, we should stress that we feel a special responsibility given that we have been able to include Native Hawaiians, so a Native population, in our cohort, and we really are the only relatively large study of this group. And we certainly are spending a lot of attention on this group and publishing our results and sharing our data with actually a number of Native Hawaiian researchers and UH researchers who are working on Native Hawaiian health. Just to finish by acknowledging our collaborators on the MEC. In yellow, you have individuals who started actually the MEC in Hawaii and USC, who are not now retired, and the rest of the team here. And I'll stop here and I'll take any questions.
I guess I should unmute if I'm going to talk. Noriko Wada had a question. Is the study open to new participants?
So the answer is no. Actually, the study was open for 1993 to 96, and really people participated by returning the questionnaires that we had sent them. However, we really would like to start a new cohort and of younger individuals using more modern method to collect data. And we are kind of looking around for funding just to at least do the pilot work that is needed to then to go to NCI and apply for a grant. But we really would like to expand our work on Asians, different groups of Asians that we have access to here in Hawaii, and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. And it would be great if we could actually start a new cohort. It would be for younger investigators than myself, but it would be something really great if we could start that.
So people should just stay tuned for.
Yes. However, we have, as I mentioned, all the studies that we are launching, we are expecting funding for these clinical trials with energy restriction and Mediterranean diet to reduce visceral fat, and we would be looking for volunteers. So you can contact us through our website if you're interested in participating in studies at the Cancer Center.
We had another question asking how the study dealt with the issue of mixed race, since so many people in Hawaii and California have a mixed ethnic background.
That's right, and it's actually something that we really are very well placed to study in Hawaii, being the more admixed state in the nation. So in the age group of the multi-ethnic cohort, and through asking about ethnicity of the parents, each parent, we actually were able to get good information on a mixture. And actually for the 70,000 people we have now genetic information on, we can look at genetic ancestry, and we find a very good correlation with the information we got through the questionnaire. But however, I think if we started a cohort of younger people, we certainly would have to systematically look at genetic ancestry to understand admixture, which in those younger age group would be much more complex than the older age group. And it's of interest in terms of research because actually when we looked at people who are mixed, we find differences that are somewhat unexpected. For example, for obesity, we find that people who are, for example, mixed Japanese and Native Hawaiians would have a weight more resembling that of Native Hawaiians, of the parent population, which is the most obese and on the average. So it's not what you would expect. You would expect kind of an average of the two parent populations, but we find a systematic bias toward being a similar weight of the most heavy, or the heaviest parent population. So it's something we want to explore if we have a chance. Further.
I was interested in, it was fascinating how you looked at the lifestyle factors, the genetic factors, the ethnic factors. There's been quite a bit of discussion lately about just the impact of the stress of being a member of an underrepresented group or a group that suffers discrimination. How do you tease that out of this kind of data? Are you seeing anything that you can tie to that?
So actually, our UCSF collaborators who do a lot of social epidemiology have just sent in a grant application to look at structural racism, looking at measures at the neighborhood level about discrimination, racial aggregation, and also statistics on crime or loan policies discriminating toward minorities in some areas more than others. So we are trying to use geospatial data linked to the residency and ethnicity of our participants to try to see if we can find association, not only with risk of cancer, unhealthy behaviors such as smoking in particular, but also we look at biomarkers and specifically methylation, DNA methylation, which is affected by environmental exposure. So it's that kind of study that we can do. It would be nice to be able to have detailed questions about your life experience, about social stress and discrimination and other things. But I think that would have been very involved and probably not feasible with that type of numbers. Also, in our latest questionnaire, we have, I think, a couple of questions on how they felt about having been discriminated during their life based on race or ethnicity. So we have not looked at those questions yet, but we will.
We have a question about people of Chinese descent, since that's a large part of the population here in Hawaii. Is there a plan to look at that specific ethnicity as you are with Japanese American?
Yeah, so in the MEC, there are about 12% of the participants are of other ethnicity, and we have Samoans, Koreans, Chinese, Filipinos. So that's in the hundred or a few thousands. So we have been able to, collect and compare data in terms of prevalence of risk factors, but it's limited in terms of what we can do with them in terms of risk of cancer. However, again, what we really would like to do is to start a new cohort focusing on different groups of Asians, such as Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Filipinos who are at increased risk of a number of diseases, as well as Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. And I think we could get large enough numbers to do that just in Hawaii.
Hank Trapito Rosenthal had a question about type 2 diabetes, and I'll invite Hank to unmute and ask the question himself. And anyone else who would like to direct their question without typing it into chat, feel free to unmute yourself when there's a break. Hank, are you there?
Okay, thank you. I'm wondering about the prevalence of type 2 diabetes in different ethnic groups under the hypothesis that, under certain conditions throughout Pacific Islands, pre-contact type 2 diabetes might have been a selective advantage and therefore still be prevalent in some island populations.
Yes, or maybe not diabetes itself, but obesity. I mean, being able to accumulate, energy in fat tissue to undergo prolonged travels with limited food supplies in the, going violence. And this propensity of, obesity would, when exposed to a Western diet, would, lead to diabetes. So that we actually are starting to study on the genetic side of things. We have a researcher at USC who is a population geneticist and working on Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders. And he's using the MEC and just got funded with a very good score, 1 percentile, to try to look at admixture in Hawaiians and compare that to their risk of diabetes in the cohort, and try to identify regions of the genome that might be Polynesian of origin that would be associated with diabetes, or some biomarkers associated with diabetes. So it has been proposed for a long time, but no real genes or even genetic regions have been identified. There has been one region that has been associated with obesity in Samoans, which actually we have replicated in Hawaiians, with a lower risk than in Samoans, but I think it's probably due to admixture. But there probably are other regions that needs to be looked at. So that's going to be ongoing. The grant was just is going to be founded this summer.
Can I say one other thing? I want to pass on a hello from Kirsten Derby.
Oh, yeah.
A friend of yours and a family friend of ours. So she says hello and thank you.
She has worked. She was a graduate student when she came through and did the summer. Well, she's still here actually. Work with us on lung cancer and smoking, and actually I show her data on those biomarkers of nicotine metabolism and smoking behaviors.
Right.
So she helped me a lot starting that area of research.
When it comes to the reporting of actual incidents of cancer and tying that back to the data, is that all on self-reporting, or are you able to tie into the Hawaii Tumor Registry, or how do you gather that information aside from the questionnaire every 5 years?
Yeah, so every year actually we link the cohort to the Hawaii Tumor Registry for Hawaii and the California Tumor Registry for the Los Angeles residents. And so we get, new cancer cases in the MEC that has occurred. So we complement that with, now that the cohort is aging, actually youngest are, I think 70 or 71. So we link the cohort as well to Medicare, and we also get diagnosis of cancer there. It's useful to find out, any cancer occurring for people who have moved out of Hawaii or California. We also link to the state vital statistics for Hawaii and California. And we also link to the National Death Index, which is a registry of death certificates for the entire country. So we also find people who have died outside those two states. So I think we're doing a really good job following up people in terms of cancer incidence and mortality.
it just boggles my mind, the data that you're dealing with. Has advances in statistical work come out of this, as in addition to the health questions?
Yes, and it goes along with I would say the technology, because technology advances with new tools, and we can ask new questions. I mean, the genetics, for example, have moved very quickly. That has posed some statistical questions, issues, because we are used to comparing with smoking a few variables, with diet a few hundred variables. As with genetic variant, we are comparing several millions of variants. So obviously, findings just due to chance are more likely, increases, and there have been new statistical methods to correct for that. In environmental epidemiology right now, there's a lot of interest in looking at exposure to mixture of toxicants, pollutants. People were usually looked at one exposure to one chemicals, but now we're able to look at several hundred chemicals, and that also poses statistical issues. So we are lucky to have excellent biostatisticians here, and there's also a very good group of biostatisticians at USC doing applied research in biostatistics, and we are benefiting tremendously working with those people.
I believe I read that the study has been continuously funded since the beginning through next year. So I'm wondering, are the grants in to continue beyond that? What are the prospects?
Yes, we are working on a renewal application, which is due in November, and we are going through, a process of bringing everyone together and deciding what we want to do in the next 5 years. But those cohorts are funded in a bit of a different way. They are funding the resource through a large grant, but under that grant, you're not supposed to do research. You are just able to do a little bit of research to improve the resource, like biostatistics, for example. So, but unfortunately, there is a limit in the budget, and we always had great plans of increasing the number of samples and sending new questionnaires and this and that. Actually, the budget is quite restrictive, and again, the research is really done through regular R1 grants or PO1 grants with NIH. So we have, a relatively large number of investigators working with us at UH, at USC, UCSF, who are very accustomed to using the MEC and know, all the subtleties about using the data. But again, we're also sharing our data with outside investigators who request specific data and samples, and they are getting their own grants, and we may or may not be on those grants, and may or may not get really money to provide data and samples. But short story is that there are different ways to get money, but the only way to keep the cohort going is to have this resource grant, to keep the people who are maintaining the databases, the biorepositories, who are answering the call when participants ask questions, who are sending questionnaires out. So we have a core staff members that we are able to keep over the years for that grants.
I was also curious about whether you're comparing data between differences between men and women within the same ethnic group.
Yes, we are, and we are finding differences in some cases than others. And obviously, there are exposures that are specific to women, such as estrogen hormone use, which we find is very important in terms of explaining risk of breast cancer, but also cancers such as colorectal cancer as well, being protective for colorectal cancer. So yes, I mean, now that we have large number of cases, we always start by comparing what we find for men and women. And when we don't find any difference, we then can group them and look in greater detail by ethnic groups, to have large enough numbers. Yes.
I'd like to open it up. Did anyone else have a question they'd like to include?
So it's like you lost half your population already? I mean, is it, I saw your last, you lost 112,000. So that's basically half of the 250,000.
That's correct. So yes, and the median age when we started was 65, and now it's 81. So the cohort has aged quite a bit. Mortality is greater in African Americans and Hawaiians. So actually we have lost more of those two groups. But we still have 100,000 people in the cohort, and we have collected data on everybody for many years, and we have samples of specimens that we can use for decades. Look at new questions, using new technologies. So I expect the cohort to go on for for several decades, at least one, I would think.
Oh,
Oh yeah.
Well, I know
beyond my professional life, I'm sure.
I also noticed that you sent out regular requests for to participants regarding the COVID experience. Yeah, I actually got that every month.
Yes, it should be finished now. I think we should. Just recently,
that was to throw COVID into the mix to find out how everybody was.
So we given the situation, this pandemic that just happened on us, we wanted to see if we could respond quickly and gather information as the epidemic was progressing on symptom testing, repercussion on daily life behaviors, and financial consequences. So we tried for the first time in the cohort to do an online survey, ask people to either answer an app that had been developed by some people at Harvard and the UK that was using different cohorts. But we also developed an online survey for just to make participants. And we asked people, and you received a letter from us, to go online or to use their phone, the app on their phone, but to go online to answer the survey. And a good number of them did, about 4,000, but not the kind of numbers we have, when we send questionnaires out. So we kept that link, and we also were unable to get funding to keep that going. But we have looked at the data, and actually, as the participants, you will receive our newsletter this summer with some results of the survey. So you can look forward to that. But we obviously found that people had delayed going to see their physician if they were sick. We found that they delayed screening for cancer, and we found that if they had cancer and were still treated, we delayed. Something like 6 or 8% of patients who were still treated had to delay their treatment. So obviously that's going to have some significant consequences, and something we're going to be able to look in the through our follow-up by linking to the tumor registry. We'll be able to see at what stage they were diagnosed, what treatment they received. So we will see if really the epidemic had, as expected, a negative consequence on staging, the stage of people, when people were diagnosed, and their survival at one point. But Yeah, remarkably, we were able, to get all the approval in 1 week to send a questionnaire out. So to send this survey out. And, it takes us usually 3 months at least to go through all the IRB requirements. And, but because of COVID, they had made our life much easier.
Yeah.
And we were able to take advantage of the cohort very quickly to get information.
Well, thank you very much.
If there are no other questions, this was a fascinating discussion, a really important project. We appreciate your taking the time to share some of the tidbits of the important findings that you've had, and our best wishes for continued funding. I think.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and good night.